So I'm very happy to welcome you to this, this session of AERI, this keynote session. This is a keynote to be delivered by Dr. Andrew Flinn. So Andrew is a reader in archival studies and oral history, Vice Dean for Postgraduate Research in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and former Director of the Archives Masters Program in the Department of Information Studies at University College London. His research interests include community-based archiving, archives and social justice, and oral history. And Andrew was formerly an archivist at the National Museum of Labour History and the People's History Museum in Manchester. And he's a member of the steering committee of the International Council on Archives section on archive education, and has been actively involved in the UK and Ireland community archives and heritage group since 2005 and vice chair since 2012. And so today, Andrew will be delivering a talk entitled Digging Where We Stand, Counter Archives, Decentering the National and Reimagining the Archival Manual. So I will hand it over to Andrew if you want to share your slides.
Okay, can you everybody see the slides? And okay, thank you. So thank you to Kirsten and to the organisers for the honour of being asked to give one of the keynotes addresses for this year's AERI. It's over 10 years since I last gave a keynote address at AERI in 2011 and in Boston. There will probably be a lot less punk rock references this time, but I am still haunted by history and unfortunately by royal jubilees. I was, I guess, slightly surprised to be asked. I think I'm too old with perhaps nothing left to say, or at least recognizing that there are other younger and different, less privileged voices that deserve to be heard more than mine. The world has certainly moved on, and the archive world has moved on too. 10 years ago, it still seemed important, urgent even, to explain and introduce community-based archives, as a few of us were doing then. Now there can be few in our piece of the information and heritage landscape that do not recognise the term and value the activity. It's not that the activity has become any less urgent, but there is no longer the need, perhaps the urgent need, to explain and justify. So what to talk about? Where do I find my relevance now, my passion? Well, it is in this, and I claim no great originality here, but in seeking to argue for profound change in archival theory and practice to an archival praxis more critically informed and socially engaged. I want to also argue that we have to decenter the state and national archives and national archivists from our thinking and our practice, to recognise that the emphasis on the records from and of the state has skewed archival thinking over the past centuries, the original sin, if you like, of dominant Western modes of archival thought and practice. Instead, we should look at developing new manuals of archival practice which reflect the multiverse of perspectives and practices, including those going under the name of community-based and counter archives. So this may be a story of two manuals and the idea of a third. So the outline of what I'm going to talk about today is to introduce the first manual around digging where you stand and community-based practice, then move on to decentering the national and the second manual, which will come no surprise to people what that might be, and then present something of a framework and a perspective on critical archival studies and archival practice, some sources in which we may draw some of the sort of the theory and engaged writing in this area. And then I'll move on towards thinking about how we relate to the past and the present and the future within these different frameworks, and thinking about what might be some of the implications for this manual of archival administration, new imagined archive of praxis and administration. The first manual, Sven Lindqvist's Gravd där du står, or Dig Where You Stand, was first published in Sweden in 1978 written by linguist and an author, journalist and activist, to both act as a clear and explicit how to do manual for factory workers and others to do their own historical research, but also, and this is equally crucial, to advocate for those participatory methods in history and memory work as being radical and potentially transformative political actions. Linguists have advocated through this manual the contestation and unsettling of historical narratives by workers doing their own research and creating their own histories as a means of empowerment and enlightenment, as a stepping stone to possible transformative social, political and industrial change. And here you see the chapter heading for the book, and you can see how linguist is taking workers and researchers, what is in the final chapter called barefoot researchers or non-academic research, through the different places where research material might be found about their workplace and about their situation. And it's both a political manual of advocating for this practice and a very kind of practical guide on how to do. Linguist history was dangerous and important because the results of history were with us today in all the uneven social and economic structures in which our lives are led. In order to bring about change, according to linguists, first you must change the picture, the narrative about society and how it's organised, and then create your own narrative. Dig Where You Stand was published widely in Nordic countries and later in Germany, inspiring and informing a mass movement of local community and workplace groups, researching their own histories, including some radical archaeological movements in Germany, and producing books, exhibitions, museums and archives in the late 1970s and through the 1980s. However, apart from a short summary article published in places like the Oral History Journal, an English language translation of the full manual was never published until now. Although linguist sadly passed away in 2019, along with my Swedish colleague, Dr. Astrid von Rosen from the University of Gothenburg, I'm excited to say that we're preparing a full, complete translation for publication in English for the first time in 2023. Whilst the book is very rooted in the Sweden of the 1970s and decidedly pre-digital, the principles of the transformative underpinning Dig Where You Stand methodology remains relevant today and a very powerful metaphor for radical historians and counter-archivists in Sweden, UK and elsewhere. And these are just on this slide, these are just a few of the contemporary current projects that use the Dig Where You Stand motif in a number of community-based and political history movements. Having said that, I was not going to define community archives. Here I place a few descriptions from over the years that describe how I feel and understand different aspects of a very diverse and somewhat uncharacterizable field. Here there is the emphasis on materials not collected by others, by other institutions, collections owned by community members, and often intended as a critical intervention into a contested field or for a goal of social change. I find and have always found strong parallels with what linguists advocate within the community archiving world of practice. More and more, I find myself drawn to the notions of the archive and the counter-archive. Artistic and subversive spaces and actions which act and resist dominant narratives and forces, specifically including, I think, state archives and surveillance social media platforms. Counter-archives offer both digital memory and meaning-making resources, spaces to inspire and to build, but also act as direct challenges to digital colonialism, the surveillance technologies and the platforms which so structure and affect our online lives. On this slide, there are a selection of different names which describe different manifestations of community-based counter or activist archives. Michelle and others advocate for the term liberatory memory work, decoupling the activity from professional identities of museum, archives and library work, and acknowledging the informal spaces, I'm quoting here directly from Michelle's work, in which knowledge is passed across generations. Whatever the names, and I'm not saying that the names are not important, I'm interested in all of these activities, all activities that have happened in these non-formal community-based environments, often using oral history and contemporary collecting to provide evidence of the community. But I've always been especially interested in archives and memory work that directly serves political projects as activist resources. And most recently with colleagues Julia Nyham, Kirsty Fife and Billy Tong, we've been focusing on those social movements and collaborative endeavours which seek to document state violence and conflict within both memory and evidence justice frameworks. And following the sadly much missed Aziz Chowdhury, better understanding the role that activist archives play in social movement. Put it another way, there are so many different ways in which we can now, and perhaps always, have seen archiving and record keeping practices as an urgent and critical activist activity. It is this perspective that I wish to hold in mind when thinking about the sources and reference points of a new archival practice. And I just put up here a kind of sort of a far from conclusive list, or a comprehensive list of the different kinds of activities which I think speak to the kind of sort of space that we can promote and look at as being a kind of sort of a counter archive activity that is both necessary and urgent, and with a focus on the record becoming something that is in service of those most in need and most marginalized and minoritized. So moving on to a piece of thinking about, well, what are we wishing to displace here? So there's the perspective and the special place in our archival thinking and praxis that I want to argue that should be decentered is that of the national and the state archive, to be replaced by something more activist, less bureaucratic, more personal and community-led. Here I'm going to reference the UK National Archives, an important example because of the combination of the preeminent role of Britain and the British state in colonialism, imperialism and the transatlantic slave trade, but also because of the global influence of archival thinking that has its origins in the Public Record Office and the UK National Archives. But I am saying that to a lesser or greater extent, the UK National Archives and its role within national archival systems could stand for and should stand for other national archives and state archives around the world. The first point I want to make in this connection is to recognise and understand about national archives and state archives is that they are fundamentally arms of the state. They are literally and indivisibly a part of the state. Often funded directly by the state, implicated in the state's record keeping system, and to different degrees, directly controlled by the state or held at arm's length, but still responsible for that state. It's important to note that I'm not saying that records held in national and state archives are not very important in all manner of ways, including for accountability and reparative justice purposes. And nor that those that work in those places are not profoundly good people, often with profoundly socially engaged agendas. I'm certainly in favour of a Gramscian long march through the institution, as well as establishing alternative structures. We can try and work within the structures that we find ourselves, but we need to be realistic about what is achievable. So I am arguing for a decentering of the state archive from the archival centre's thinking and practice. Because until the state and the state's bureaucracy is profoundly reformed and transformed, National Archives will remain fundamentally an arm of that state and not independent of it. And this means that we have a political state body playing a dominant role in defining the Archives and Records Centre theory and practice internationally as well as nationally. And I suppose, reference the role that National Archives play within the International Council of Archives. Consider just some of the recent scandals regarding records and record keeping which have occurred in the UK over the last 10 years. The destruction and withdrawal of vital public records, huge and significant hidden and closed archives, most notably the 1.2 million Foreign Office files kept and hidden away in the so-called special archive in Hounslow Park, pictured on this slide. Continued debates about migrated, displaced and stolen archives, and the activities of surveillance state organisations and their record-keeping practices. In all such cases, the National Archives seem at best powerless, either unaware of or unable to override decisions made within government department record-keeping functions with regard to public records, or worse, maybe at some level be actively complicit with the state's policies. Even more so when the oversight and appeal process is for the most part via the government. Looking, for instance, for the National Archives internationally to solve the migrated archives disputes seems to me to be looking in the wrong place. The real decision-making processes lies in the heart of the state, and the archives carry out those policies as the arm of that state, rather than being independent actors in this field. The influence of state archive is also, of course, very strong on the historically dominant Western archival theory. Last year, in an excellent master dissertation research at UCL, and hopefully soon to be published, to be a published article, Daniel McKee examined the imperial legacies in British archiving. And not only did he convincingly demonstrate the roots of the UK National Archives and the Public Record Office and the archival thinking it represented, as being rooted in the development of the imperial state bureaucracy, the 19th and 20th century, but also, I think, fairly uniquely in the way he did this, gave close attention to our second manual, 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐥𝐞, Jenkins, a manual of archival administration, published in 1922 and 37, and gave close attention to the manual, its author, and the rules that it advocated for archival practice, and as seeing them being embedded within that same imperial state bureaucracy. And amongst his conclusions were that the underlying ideology that the manual advocates can be identified as a clear legacy of imperial bureaucracy, and that many of the principles that we associate as Jenkinsonian actually predate Jenkinson by some period into this development of the imperial state bureaucracy. So the doctrines of neutrality, the technical description, the primacy of the imperial state bureaucracy over research and over research record keeping functions all have a logic and an origin in his thinking in this imperial bureaucracy and the state bureaucracy. I want to place the influence of imperial estate structures and archival practice being reinforced by the influence of Jenkinson and the process and the promotion of the manual and its rule throughout much of dominant Western discourse around archiving, is as a kind of as a product of this focus on national archives. But as Hannah Ishmael and others have so clearly pointed out, there were and are many other approaches to archiving: Pan-African, feminist, queer, indigenous, counter and community-based approaches which challenge and seek to replace the state-sponsored approaches and to reimagine the manual and its reparative histories that it can support. And in her work, Hannah has looked at the writing of Arthur Schomburg and the referencing to digging up its past, almost 50 years and more before Lindqvist was using that metaphor in the same way, and emphasizing on the urgency and the repair that can be gone through this kind of archival activism and history making. And Ishmael goes on to link this to a more contemporary concern with the power of reparative history, particularly in dismantling the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade. I want to place this centering of the state and promotion of a counter-archive practice within a framework of discussions about the archive and archival practice that has been active for at least 50 years. And as we have seen from the work of Schomburg, in reality for much longer. But there is this discourse which differs and provides an alternative way of thinking from more traditional ideas promoted by Jenkins. This more active and critically engaged form of archival thinking and practice aligns archiving with power relations in society and seeks to counter and challenge those power relations via active engagement with questions of rights, justice, identity, and liberation. Archiving for social change and transformation in the lives of individuals and communities. The following, of course, is of course in no way a comprehensive list or a new canon. This is a rich and ever multiplying area. But these are some of the writers and ideas that have and continue to influence me and my thinking. But there are many more from many different perspectives that should be acknowledged in the development of our new manual. So to begin with the radical historian Howard Flinn, who in an influential talk to the Society of American Archivists in 1970 famously rejected the neutrality of the archivist as something that effectively perpetuated the political and economic status quo, and instead argued for a rebellion by archivists, which would humanize their inevitably political power. And he puts forward some propositions of areas in which archivists should be working in a campaign to open all government documents to the public, but also to compile a new world of documentary material about the lives, desires, and needs of ordinary people. Two concerns which I think motivate activist archivists to stay. 20 years ago, speaking from the context of the struggle against apartheid and its archival legacies, the South African archivist Vern Harris similarly recognised the archive as a battleground for meaning and significance, and archivists set action that can either replicate, if not reinforce, prevailing relations of power, or they can actively work to complicate and challenge those archival meanings of representations. The thrust of these arguments, and others drawing more directly on critiques of white supremacy and patriarchy, underpin the development by American archival theorist and educator Michelle Caswell and others of a critical archival studies, and also, critically also, of a practice which combines a recognition of the archive's relationship to power and oppression with an unapologetic active commitment to developing an archival practice which liberates rather than oppresses. In a similar fashion, in recent years, along with other heritage and information disciplines, archivists and archival scholars have advanced debates about archival approaches to social justice, including the statement here developed by myself and colleagues in North America, Wendy Duff and David Wallace, which recognised the systemic inequalities and iniquities in societies, and that the role that records and archival practice could have in supporting social justice endeavours. AERI itself has contributed greatly to this dialogue and discourse and the framework And the idea of the archival multiverse, which encompassing the pluralism of evidentiary texts, memory keeping practices and institutions, bureaucratic and personal motivations, community perspectives, and cultural legal constructs, as all existing within a kind of archival framework, and not only looking to be one dominant way of thinking, is clearly something that could inform this way of thinking. Catherine Hobbs's work and others on personal records, the concept of affect and emotion, and thinking about how archival thinking could be rethought and rebalanced, moving away from models of government and corporate record keeping, and looking about what difference would it make to think about archives that documented our complex inner humanity, and rather than just our surface activities, and think how that might broaden archival thinking generally. Coming to the end of my kind of sort of framework and people's writings who kind of sort of influenced the way I think and continue to think. Obviously, the work of Stuart Hall in many ways about arguing for the power of heritage and of being represented, but also of the necessity of taking control of that process for oneself, of constituting the archive as an act of contestation, of an intervention into an archival field and an historical field, in order to change that narrative and that discourse. And I think Stuart Hall's work is forever engaging and enlightening in this fashion. Finally, I would like to just reference the work of Aziz Chowdhury and his colleague Salim Valley in their various works on activism and learning, workers' education, and archives. Aziz and Salim are written, I think, exceptionally detailed, but also kind of in a highly motivated way about the role that learning and archives can play in the lives of social movements. And it's a long quote here, which I'm not going to read through, but it talks of the different ways that the activities within the community counter-archiving framework support a range of activities and activisms in a very sort of profound way. So what does some of this activity look like and mean? What are these activities, and how do they connect to the real world issues of struggle and of change and transformation? So I've put to here a kind of a way of thinking about the way that community archives and counter archives work in connection with thinking about the past, the present, and the future, in terms of kind of a salvage and recovery, use and aspiration. And it chimes for me very much with the idea that another world is possible, and that the roots of that other world can often be found in the past and in the archive. And chimes, I think, again with some recent writing of Michelle Caswell's, that archival endeavours should not be about documenting the past, nor even imagining the future, as she had previously argued, but about building a laboratory now. So it's about change now and working towards change now. And I think if we examine how some of the work of community archives in these different aspects, in the salvage, use and aspiration, we can see how those arguments play out, or how those activities play out. So in terms of the first aspect, we have the notion of recovery, which sometimes is almost has a kind of sort of a metaphor around salvage and around saving something from being irrevocably lost, and of being a kind of activist action, an active action to save material that is not considered to be worthwhile by others, but bears particular important and significant historical materials and narratives. And these are two quotes from within the working class and labour movements about the urge to collect these materials in 1980. But counter archives, including digital archives, also preserve this kind of material, often not considered strictly archival or ephemeral and intangible, but are actually crucial to telling some personal community histories, otherwise not represented in mainstream collections. Sometimes preservation itself can be an act of resistance, particularly in digital spaces and acting in the environment of what Ben David has called this environment of surveillance and data colonialism, dominated by large private social media monopolies who either claim ownership of data uploaded on their sites or act with or under pressure from state actors to hand over or delete that data. Counter archives like the Egyptian 858 counter archive, an archive of resistance, has sought to collect and preserve mainly citizen-sourced film and video records of the 2011 Egyptian revolution, which have otherwise been at a serious risk of loss and deletion on more public platforms. One activist archivist involved with the 858 archive described it thus: putting together this archive is a subversive act. It's a way of battling the narrative being put out by the state to erase history, to have people forget what was possible. That notion again of a future being located in the past, and an act of preservation to try and make sure that possibility isn't lost. This work is also very important in using the terminology developed by Michelle Caswell of these acts of recovery and preservation of lost materials, such as carried out by Setner, the Talking Syria archive, about challenging the erasure and the symbolic annihilation of a community or a people, and that community archives being involved in the act of representational belonging, speaking both to their own community and to wider society. And that brings us on to the question of use and of acting within the present. But speaking of challenging erasure by communities and activists brings us to the next aspect of understanding the counter-archive. Preservation and salvage that we've just discussed is not for preservation's sake alone itself. Like Lindquist's Dig Where You Stand counter-archivists and historians, the community archives seek to make and manage change in the present and in the future by engaging actively with the past and with the material. And here we have an exhibit from the museum, which I used to work in, that Kirsten mentioned, People's History Museum, National Labour History Museum, but actually referencing a much older period of education and provocation against the establishment, of using history in the past in order to provoke change, to involve the people. Here we can see a screenshot from the Syrian archive, which seeks to preserve endangered material, which might be verified for evidential use, but also plays a memory role. And I think here it's important to not see remembrance and evidence as a binary. This archive, it can be and is used and viewed for both. In a recent investigation into the Syrian archive, published in 2021 in the very interesting War Archives and Archival Imaginaries, War and Contemporary Art, the activist and researcher Dima Saber interviewed citizen contributors and human rights activists and found that while the contributors were mainly motivated by the archive acting as a memorial to friends and a way of life lost, whilst activists also hoped that the material, if preserved, might also be a resource for seeking some post-conflict justice for human rights abuses and state-sponsored violence. Similarly, human rights activist groups such as Witness promote how to document, record and archive the abuse and violence against individuals and communities. Many of these counter-archiving initiatives seek to promote the importance of traditional archival values, such as reliability and evidential values for use for possible legal redress, but also promote a concern for ethical collecting and management to ensure that these same materials cannot be used to further damage or harm those experiences or witnessing abuse and violence. Moving on to the future, aspiration and dreaming of a future. We've seen that these archives are collecting and using material in education work, in campaigns, for justice, or for building solidarities. They use these materials in the present, but they're also a very important resource for aspiring and imagining the future. Archival commentators like the anthropologist 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐥𝐿 and the historian Caroline Steedman have both written evocatively of the archive being a place in which dreams of a Liverpool future can be imagined, the past becoming a resource from which to imagine and to build those futures as possible futures. Archival activists also frequently refer to their archives as places where different futures can be imagined and built. The spaces themselves are seen as social spaces where engaging with learning and organising from the process of engagement can lead to action and change. In the words of the Mayday Rooms, a social movement space and archive in London, the Mayday Rooms is a space where the future can be produced more than the past is contemplated. And there's always, I guess, this sense of the engagement with the materials, the existence of the materials is not simply about a contemplation or a backwards looking activity. It's about something that is about impacting and making change in the present. And but as I come to the end of what I want to say, or nearly to the end of what I want to say, I'm going to begin by, I suppose, sort of summarising what I think are the contributions to be made from digging where you stand and community-based archiving activities, and then I'm going to move on from that to a broader consideration of some of the perspectives aspects that I think might usefully be embraced within a new kind of archival praxis or a new manual of archival praxis, which descends some of the older state-driven and bureaucratic models of archives and archival practice. So I think it's in thinking about what's the contribution of these counter archives, of these alternative archival spaces and alternative archival endeavours. I think we can see that that history is otherwise absent or marginalised are more possible when these collections are built and held. But community archives can, not always, but they certainly seek to hold these materials within certainly within a contextual framework in which they make sense within the community about which they refer and where they were to some extent created. But they can also seek in many cases to hold those materials safely and ethically, and particularly in this context, I'm thinking about those materials from which they're being accessed by other agents, particularly agents of the state, and enforcement might actually be dangerous to the individuals who have contributed those archives. So community archives are increasingly thinking, or have historically thought about, how to keep those materials safe and away from harm, and balancing the need to remember and the need to retain, salvage these materials against what potentially is the damage that could be. These materials are profoundly affective. They affect people. They have an impact on them both as individuals and communities. They connect people with place and the past. They offer an amplification of voice and perspective. They build community. I think it's important to kind of recognise that in a lot of ways these materials are about building the community as much as they are about being about the community itself. So they play a role about telling a community about its past, but also through the telling of that past, building that community. They can provide evidence for justice and reparation campaigns, and they are a source for promoting solidarity, a resource for communities to act together to find in the past strategies for responding to change, and to, as I said, to aspire to other possible ways of living and futures. I just wanted to put up this slide to give a kind of idea of kind of sort of different ways in which we could be kind of engaging with these topics in research. There's just that might all be contributing in different, possibly small ways to this development of a new archival practice. And this is just, you know, research that I'm involved, all of it with colleagues, all of it with collaborative. I'm not in any way suggesting that this is the sum total of the important research that's going on in the world, but it's indicative of the kinds of different activities could be going on that can all be drawn and contribute to new ways of thinking about archival practice. So along with colleagues in Poland, Portugal, Brazil, and indeed elsewhere, China and Sweden, we're working to try and understand what community archives mean and look like in these different countries, and to get beyond what is, I think, to this far been a kind of a quite Anglo-dominated conversation and discourse about community archives, and a kind of a terminology that is, you know, has definitely got traction elsewhere in the world, but trying to kind of really get to grips with what it means in different national circumstances. How is it interpreted? What roles is it playing? And I think that's a really important part of this work, to not to reinscribe a kind of a cultural dominance on this with a kind of very Anglo language and a very Anglo way of thinking about this. Oral history is a very important part of a lot of community archive and counter-archival technologies, approaches, and along with colleagues at UCL and in Germany, I'm working on thinking about what digital and digital humanities approaches to using oral history and engaging with oral history, what that might mean, both in a positive way about thinking about what new stories or ways of engaging with stories that are often locked away in oral history interviews in repositories, what might come from that, but also what dangers and ethical issues that might arise out of that kind of big data digital humanities approach. I've mentioned the work that I'm doing with Julianne, Kirsty, and Billy into thinking about conflict and counter archives around questions of ethics and, again, authentication, reliability and security. And this is a kind of area of work that I think is really interesting, to think about these very specifically digital archives that have a really kind of strong human rights and activist campaigning archives, but they're specifically and explicitly using kind of archival practice and archival work to work with their materials. And then finally, the two further more community-based focuses, which are looking at both at questions about the visibility and of these, particularly as big shifts in aggregation and digital collections, initiatives to bring together collections online. Where do community collections sit with that? Do we want them to be brought in there? What happens if they're left outside and don't have that visibility? And finally, I think a really fundamental question about the long-term sustainability of community collection, and particularly digital community collections. Work that is ongoing, particularly with the Community Archives and Heritage Group, about how initiatives there might help to sustain collections held it. So my final few slides, and I've just going to go on a little over my time, I suspect, are thinking about what this new manual of praxis, decenting the state and emphasising counter and community-based archives. What might it look like? And again, this isn't in any way an attempt to bound what this like. It's some suggestions that come from my thinking about these issues, but it's not in any way to set either identify this as a comprehensive list or to put any limits on how we might, you know, discuss other parts and things that aren't here. So I think this new manual, if there is to be such a thing, would embrace clearly embrace an active and an activist approach, and certainly would embrace a critical thinking, a critically informed approach to practice, which is allied to a commitment to transformation. But this model, I think, is really clearly about practice, about making change in the world, but having that practice informed by a program of activist and critical thinking. It would encourage ethical, social justice, liberatory and multiverse orientations to both education and to practice. It would understand the significance of records and record keeping in both supporting and hindering struggles for social and reparative justice. It would embrace post-custodial and non-custodial approaches to supporting community generating content in community settings. It would support the development of an archival mindset in digging communities and activist groups, and particularly an archival mindset that is not reliant on surveillance technologies and platforms, that helps move away from technologies that claim ownership over material and may seek to delete or exploit that material without community approval. But it would develop a framework for valuing effective and personal community records of emotion, that it would look not just at personal records, but look at kind of the whole area of a kind of an emotional landscape and an effective landscape within an archival frame and within archival appraisal process. And finally, and possibly most significant at this point in time, in some ways, it would embrace extending digital preservation and curation practice into community setting, So move beyond the focus on digital preservation and digital curation in institutions, and look at that, at where we are with that practice in community-based settings. So helping to sustain the reliability and accessibility of community-based encounter archives at the time. So as I say, this is just a few kind of sort of concluding thoughts on my part about what this new manual, a reimagined manual, might contain or might embrace. But I hope it's a start for others to critically develop or rip up and start again. But the idea, I think, is to embrace the alternative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that really fascinating talk, which also is a call to action, right? Like letting us sort of imagine what the future could look like for archives, and yeah, really enabling us to do some of that imagining, both as you say, as archival scholars, but also practically for the archival profession and people working in a variety of fields to really consider what it means to work in an archival way and help create that counter archive. Now, we don't have a lot of time, but we do have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions or comments. If anyone wants to ask a question, please feel free to you can unmute yourself and ask the question direct, or if you want to put something in the chat, I can read it out for everyone. Yeah, however, if anyone has a question, we can go to that. Well, I will ask a question while everyone else is hopefully formulating their brilliant and insightful questions. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about how you would envisage this new manual framework call to action for archival education. I guess a lot of people have spoken about people have spoken about the sort of move towards more critical and liberatory and revolutionary archival theory thinking, but that's not necessarily translated much into archival practice. And so I wonder if you could reflect on how maybe this type of the approach you're sort of advocating could maybe draw those two together more, or provide more opportunities for changes in archival practice.
Yes, and I think this is a really important issue, because I think the stress here is not about or it shouldn't be about something that is merely something that we can write about and give conference papers about and feel very kind of sort of virtuous and worthy that we've given another paper in which we've kind of called out the old world and called on a new world. It has to be engaging with practice, and I think there is a whole area of practice out there today which involves a lot of the kind of institutions and the endeavours that I was talking about, that are there for people to get involved with and to use those skills in those practiced environments. But equally, the majority of positions that people are working in are within those more corporately or organizationally framed organizations that perhaps offer a greater challenge to an almost kind of institutional foundational challenge to some of these kinds of work, and I think that is a challenge for us to think about in when we're thinking about how we developed this for a program of education, is that how we bridge that gap between advocating for these practices, with those kind of sort of liberatory frameworks, and how that we can equip people for them to go into institutions where those institutions may be fundamentally at odds with some of those activities. And the best way that I can think about that, I suppose, is in that sort of idea of a kind of a divided world, in the sense that that within the institutions there is a process akin to the kind of sort of long march of the intellectuals through the institutions of seeking to bring about change from the inside, and then there is kind of alternative centres outside, and thinking about ways in which those two processes can meet. But in saying that, I'm aware of a kind of contradiction in my whole paper, which is really about kind of sort of saying that these national archives or state archives are somehow irreparable in a way, because that they're that while the state exists and is operating in different ways, then it's very difficult to conceive of national archives or state archives operating. So there is a contradiction at the heart of that. I think the only way we can resolve it is by working within those institutions as far as we are able, and seeking broad social change that would then allow those institutions to change, but seeking opportunity where those opportunities arise to collaborate, to work with others outside those institutions, to bring others into those institutions, seek to provide kind of sort of change, to see whether there are ways of reallocating resources from the institution to the community. So it's a really big and important question, and it's not one that there is an easy answer to, but I think it is something that we have to aim at, and not make something that's another conference presentation or another keynote, but it's actually something that seeks to address that essential contradiction in what's being advocated here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that's really great to hear. And yeah, I think archives for me have always been inherently practical, and the more practical things we can do in this space, I think, for the better. I can't see any other questions and comments, and I am conscious of time. We are at the hour. So I think if anyone wants to quickly say something or type something, that's fine. But I might otherwise bring this session to a close and thank Andrew for his time today and for sharing those really, really interesting ideas with us, and contributing so well to this virtual AERI. So yeah, thank you so much, Andrew, and thanks everyone for being here. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your days and nights, and time at AERI as well. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, wherever you are in the world, or whatever time it is. I'm about to leave for the first Community Archives Conference in Ireland, so it's kind of an exciting time and a relevant time to what I've just been saying. So hope the rest of AERI goes well for everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone, and I will now end the session. And yeah, thank you again, Andrew, for your time and insights. Bye-bye.
Bye.